Hello and welcome to a Squirrel Plays. It's me, the Squirrel, and today I'd like to talk more about the modern video game industry. More specifically, I'd like to make the argument that updating a game after it's been fully released, and I use that term very loosely, is actually bad for the game and the studio making the game. When I made my earlier videos, I would present a problem and then follow up with some potential solutions on how to fix it. This one, however, is going to be a little bit different. That's because for this argument, the only solution for me is to just stop doing it. But we're here for conversation and dialogue, so I'll present my case, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and why you think updates for a video game post-launch are actually a good idea and healthy for the game. If you'd like even more conversation, feel free to join the Squirrel Discord using the link in the description. Now, let's crack this nut open and dig in. The first thing I need to do is clarify what I mean when I use the words fully released and update, because in this day and age, that can have a few different meanings. What exactly is fully released? Is that when the studio announces they're leaving early access and going 1.0? Or does it mean once they've fully stopped adding updates and addressing bugs and have moved on to their next project? Or maybe it just means they're done making DLC for the game, but will still address bugs as possible in the future. In the context of this video, I will be using the term fully released as a game leaving early access and officially going 1.0. As for updates, I will not be referring to bug fixes and patches. In this context, updates will refer to changes made to the game that either 1. Add content to the game, 2. Remove content from the game, or 3. Change something within the game that already exists in such a way that it will affect the way you play the game. To expand on number 3 a little bit, let's use a sniper rifle as an example from your favorite first-person shooter. Let's say the sniper rifle could one-shot kill anybody in multiplayer, even on body shots. The studio decides, well, that's too much, and makes it to where the sniper rifle now takes 2 body shots to kill or 1 headshot. The weapon was neither added nor removed from the game, but it will 100% affect the way you play the game now. And with that cleared up, let me lay out a list of reasonings why I think post-launch updates are a bad thing, and then we'll dive into each one. For starters, I believe that a lot of the content that gets added after a game's release is content that should have been available at release. I'm not a big fan of the whole drip feed approach. Second, I feel like adding in things after a game's release can make the game too complicated. Too many features or things to do can get added in and they don't fit in with the game's natural flow, causing confusion for the player. Survival games are a big victim of this. Third, an update to the game can outright ruin the game for people. And by ruin, I mean either from a technical standpoint, meaning the game no longer runs on their machine anymore, or it can ruin the enjoyment due to changes made. And fourth, refusing to move on to another project and sticking with a single game for years on end prevents growth for the studio, as well as making the experience redundant for the player. But now that you're already conjuring up a counter-argument and getting ready to rip me a new one in the comments, let me explain each point in just a little bit more detail. Argument number 1 is that I feel like it's content that should have been available at the game's release. Again, this is not counting bug fixes and patches. Those are a different story. Let's say you're all about early access for games and you want to support the development. Shouldn't you, of all people playing the game, get the best experience possible at release? You were there when things were being molded in the fire, you were reporting the bugs and giving feedback, making suggestions, and providing the devs with plenty of data to help finish their product. So why is it that you, of all players this game has, got the worst end of the deal? When the game goes 1.0, that game will be in its weakest post-launch condition it will ever be. Players who didn't support the game during early access and showed up 3 years later will get a better deal. They'll have a game loaded with more features, more content, and most likely an overall polished experience. But not you. You got the worst part of the whole thing. Let's look at Deep Rock Galactic. This was a fun game when they launched their 1.0. Me and my brother put a lot of hours into it, and, well, we had a good time. There's 4 classes you can choose from, with each class having 2 main weapons to choose from, as well as 2 sidearms and a few grenade choices. As fun as it was, the game did get a little redundant after a while. The studio started to drip feed some new content here and there, such as some new enemy types, some new mission types, and even a new biome to play on. At this point, I was already a little frustrated because those things would have been really, really nice to have at the beginning. But now that I've already put a ton of hours into it, I really don't have the desire to play the same thing again, but with just a little extra variety. But my biggest complaint through the whole experience was that I wished there were more guns to choose from to offer a bit more gameplay customization. Wouldn't you know it, almost exactly a year and a half after the game went 1.0, they rolled out another update that included one new primary for every class. The problem, though, is that I had already put in my hours. I wanted the guns 200 hours ago when I was playing the game. I don't want them now that I'm tired of the game because even if they were great and a lot of fun, it's still the same game that I'm playing, doing the same missions with the same classes. The spice was too little too late. That's content that either should have been available when they released the game or saved for the next one. This drip feed content only makes me wish I didn't buy your game when it came out and instead waited 3 or 4 years till you were done updating it and I could have caught it on sale for $2 because, well, now it's considered old or you're desperately trying to get new customers because you refuse to move on to your next project. And yes, in case you're wondering, they added one new secondary for each class almost 6 months after the new primaries, and as of recording this, they just released one new grenade type for each class. So 2.5 years post their 1.0 release, they're still drip feeding content into the game. I mean, honestly, if this is how it's going to work, what is the difference between an early access game and a 1.0 game other than the price going up post 1.0 for some strange reason? When I buy a game, I would really like to have the full game. If a game is released, then players shouldn't have to join a Discord server or follow something on Twitter or who knows what else in order to see where a game's development progress should be. They shouldn't have to read through a series of patch notes in order to get their bearings and figure out how things are currently working. A player should be able to buy the game and go play without worry. Now, my second point is that piling on updates to a game after release can make them too complicated, which might sound a little bit silly, but stay with me. While Deep Rock Galactic's updates might be too late, they do at least fit into the game's natural flow for the most part. So far, anyway. Other games don't do that. Survival crafting games such as Conan Exiles suffer from this tremendously. New mechanics and features get added into the game, and in no way, shape, or form do they fit into the game's natural line of progression because they didn't come into play until after the fact. Let's have a look at Conan Exiles. The game went 1.0 on May 8th of 2018. 5 months later, in October of the same year, they added a pet system. Now, as somebody who has played this game, I can tell you with certainty that nothing in this game is explained. As I was writing up the script and digging through the update history of the game, I can see why, because most things were added after the game released. But my point is, that's an entire new system that was added to the game 5 months after its release. Then in May of the following year, which would be May of 2019, they added a new dungeon, a new mini-dungeon, some new pets, as well as revamping some NPC settlements. This included new bosses and new loot. So once again, more things for you as the player to keep up with. December of 2019, they added mounts to the game. You could now have a trusty steed to ride. March 10 of 2020, the follower system got an overhaul. May 7th of 2020, the follower system got some more tweaks made to it. October 28th of 2020, all the crafting benches were reworked. Some were removed, some were added, some were changed. A lot of what you knew about the game was no longer relevant. January 6th of 2021, and boy, what a day that was, they rolled out an update that completely reworked the way stamina and shield blocking worked. August 19th of 2021, weapons were rebalanced. And then, in the beginning of September of this year, they dropped in a humongous update that completely overhauled the way your character leveled up and the way your skills worked. And again, nothing in the game presents these new features to you naturally. You have to either play with somebody who already knows how to do everything so they can teach you, or you can attempt to dig through a wiki that's over 50% out of date due to incessant changes made to the game. While this particular game isn't exactly complicated, it is a bit of a jumbled mess due to new features being dumped into it after its release. Arc is another fine example of too many features being added after release. And as a matter of fact, Arc is a fantastic example of everything a game developer shouldn't do. Now, we'll give you this one. If the development team could slide all their new mechanics and updates into a game in such a way that they felt natural and new players could pick up just as easily as the people that have already been playing it, it wouldn't be such a big deal. However, my first issue would still stand because, well, that's content that should have been available at release. But before we move on to point number 3, let's have a look at the updates that came to Ark since its 1.0 release in August of 2017. Actually, let's not do that because this video is going to be long enough as it is. Instead, let's roll over to reason number 3, and that is how an update can ruin the game for a player. The easier example would be when something on the technical side happens behind the scenes, causing a game to just, well, straight up not run for the player anymore. While I don't feel like that one happens too often, it does happen. Usually that kind of thing is addressed the best it can, but, well, it does still happen. The bigger problem is when an update makes a change to the game in such a way it ruins what a player previously enjoyed. And by that, I do not mean a bug that somebody was exploiting and then it got fixed, preventing said player from benefiting from it. I'm talking about a design decision that was planned, tested, and implemented into the game, and the player decided they liked it enough to pay for the game and own it. I'll give you a good example of this. Vermintide 2. Being fans of the first Vermintide, me and my brother picked this game up a good while back. Long story short, we put a ton of hours into it because, well, we absolutely loved it. Don't get me wrong, it had a world of issues that never should have made it into its launch, but at least they were slowly getting fixed and we could still play the game. Now, if you were to read through Steam forums, Reddit posts, and other general feedback about the game, one thing that the entire community agreed on was that the combat in the game was fantastic. 10 out of 10, no changes needed. Well, guess what they did? About 2 years after their 1.0 launch, they had the bright idea to completely flip the combat upside down. And let me tell you, I was not the only angry squirrel at that park. People were absolutely livid, and rightfully so. The game I enjoyed to play and would actually like to continue playing is no longer available. Along with the update that ruined the combat came an overhaul to the perks, which completely removed the playstyle that I personally enjoyed. It was an update that nobody asked for, yet one they felt needed to be had. You may have noticed that Vermintide 2 was actually free just recently on Steam, and I'd wager that's because they are incredibly desperate to get some new players after a long run of bad decisions and running off their original players. And Vermintide 2 isn't the only one. Deep Rock Galactic did the same thing to me. What was normally a game about space dwarves shooting bugs turned into space dwarves shooting bugs and robots from a rival corporation. The rival corporation robots feel incredibly out of place and are very, very, very not fun to deal with. That update is what sealed the deal for me. Once again, the game I originally enjoyed is no longer available. And for my last point, I believe that post-launch updates make a game redundant and it prevents growth from the studio. I'll use Conan Exiles as an example again. As I mentioned before, the most recent update for Conan Exiles completely overhauled the skills you get from leveling up. It also added in a brand new magic system. Magic was never a part of the game before. On top of that, it completely revamped the way building structures worked. The building was definitely a positive change, but I suppose one could argue both sides for the skill changes and the magic system. Regardless, no matter how much they change and overhaul, it's still the same game. Yes, your skills may be new. Yes, you have magic now. Yes, building is easier, but you know what? You're still on the same map, doing the exact same thing. Basically, all you've done is mod it. Unfortunately, you can't turn that mod off if you decide you don't like it. Not only does this not actually add anything to the game, this is what prevents growth from the studio. Instead of taking what they've learned and moving on to their next project, they stick around and just mod the thing to death, tweaking one thing after another until they have a mess that's beyond repair. It's a cheap trick to make your audience think they're getting more bang for their buck. Or if you're creating and selling DLC, then you're basically just riding the gravy train. The initial creation of the game, also known as the hard part, is already done. You're just tacking something a little extra on top of that and getting a decent few bucks for minimal work. Let's have a look at Ark. The base game is $20 as of recording this, no sales or anything, just straight $20 from Steam. Though I swear it was about $40 or so once it hit 1.0, but maybe I'm losing my marbles. Regardless, this is the part that required all the initial work. This is where they started from nothing. They went from the drawing board to some prototypes, worked through a lot of trial and error, though I'd argue it was mostly error, and eventually they had some shell of a game that they thought was fit for public consumption. Surprisingly, the game was a hit. It had plenty of players despite its horrendous amount of issues, and people were enjoying it while simultaneously hating it more than anything on the planet. Instead of taking what they learned and moving on to Arc 2, they decided to milk the ever-living daylights out of it with DLCs. Now, don't get me wrong, Arc 2 is definitely a thing and well on its way. We all knew it would happen, but I'm talking about what took place before Arc 2's announcement. While Arc was still in early access, they released their first DLC, Scorched Earth. Same game, just a different map with some new dinos and items for $10. Problem is, every bug, issue, problem, and broken mechanic that exists in the base game that is Arc also exists in this DLC. As an added bonus, you now have new bugs, issues, problems, and broken mechanics to deal with. This concept continues on through the rest of the DLCs, which included Aberration and Extinction, both for $10 each. Then you had the 2 Genesis DLCs, or at least I think there's 2, I kind of lost track. Point is, it's still the same thing, new map, new dinos, new gear, all including the same bugs since launch as well as the new ones. Now you're 5 DLCs deep, and what have you, as a studio, learned? Absolutely nothing, other than the fact that people will pay for just about anything. Speaking of, you can always support me by clicking the link in the description. Instead of taking what they learned and creating something new and better, they just remade the same thing over and over and over again, making the same mistakes all along the way. And Arc isn't the only guilty one out there. Lots of studios are doing it. They'd rather milk a product for all it's worth because, well, it's easier. There's less risk involved and there's definitely less labor. But in the long run, I think they cut themselves short and miss out on even bigger earnings. Have a look at Everspace by Rockfish Games. Those guys had a vision of what they wanted to make. They knew what they wanted to do, but the only problem was money. They didn't have the funds to create the scale of game they wanted to. Originally, they wanted to make more of an open-world space experience where you could level up and upgrade your ship, take on missions, have more of a story to follow, and they really wanted a handcrafted experience. They didn't want every area to be randomly generated despite it being in space. They wanted to do it by hand, but as you can imagine, well, that's a little expensive. So what did they do? They made themselves a stepping stone. They created Everspace, which was the same look and feel as far as the controls go for the game they wanted to make. However, they decided to make this game a roguelite. Why? Well, as I mentioned in another video, because that's a heck of a lot cheaper. Don't get me wrong, the game is still fun, and I've never seen flying controls that tight before. Solid 10 out of 10 would recommend despite being a roguelite. They made that game so they could make the actual game they wanted to make. Everspace did well for itself, and they're taking everything they learned from it and creating the game they wanted to in the first place. And they're calling it Everspace 2. Instead of mod and tweaking everything, they're taking that knowledge and experience and moving it onto a bigger and better project. That's how you're supposed to do it, so kudos to them. Personally, I'm super excited for Everspace 2, and I really wish I had the streaming skills that their guy Eric has. I don't know how that guy does it, but I swear he can read and communicate with like 3 streaming chats at once while flying and shooting at a higher skill level than me. Dude's got some skills for sure and does a fine job keeping things entertaining. But really, that's all I have. We're at the end of the video, and there's something I'd like to start doing now that I have somewhat of an audience. I think at the end of my videos, I'm going to start doing some kind of follower shoutouts. It could be a comment I appreciated or found really interesting, or even something as simple as a funny avatar and name that made me giggle when I saw it. Like this guy or this guy. You get the idea. Anyway, that is it. My argument is to not update games post-launch other than bug fixes and patches, as I feel it does more harm than good. And now that you've heard all my reasonings, what are yours? Do you prefer post-launch updates and want games to continue down this path? Tell me why you enjoy playing the same thing over and over again with just a few minor tweaks done to it. I'd love to hear your reasoning. And before anybody makes the argument about playing Skyrim for the 100th time because mods, well, let me say this. When it comes to that scale of modding, the modding itself becomes the game. The challenge is now to make what you consider the ultimate Skyrim experience. That's why so many people can spend hours upon hours modding their Skyrim, only to never actually play it. All right, I'm done. Squirrel out.
This is madness!
This is
A Squirrel Plays.